just getting a sense of how the room felt the debate went. I'm then going to provide you with a model of an adjudication. We're going to talk about why I structured my adjudication in that way. Then we're going to talk about some of the difficulties of reaching a decision in this debate, which at some points was really excellent, which at other points was not as good, was kind of inconsistent, might have been a theme for the debate. So some parts were great, some parts were less great. First of all, we're going to go around polling who thought who won. So put your hand up if you thought this team won. Put your hand up if you believe that opening government won this debate. Put your hand up if you think opening opposition won this debate. Put your hand up if you think closing government won this debate. Put your hand up if you think closing opposition won this debate. Alright, so you guys were clearly in consensus while we spent a long time discussing this. Put your hand up if you thought this was a closing half debate. As in you think closing half were the top two teams in the debate. Okay, and put your hands up if you think this was an opposition bench debate. So you think the two opposition teams are the first two place teams in the debate. Alright, so less consensus. Okay, this is a way that we gave the debate, and this is the way that we would deliver the adjudication if we were required to in front of the room, which should be the chair, unless the chair is outvoted by their panelists, in which case the chair should never give an adjudication when in dissent. It's very confusing for the whole room. Okay. We gave this debate in the following order. The first place went to closing government, second place went to closing opposition, third place went to opening opposition, and fourth place went to opening government. The only position that the panel was definitely clear on was that opening government placed last in this debate. I'm going to talk quickly about the reasons why that was before talking about the confusion between the following three rankings and why they ultimately were decided the way they were. In terms of what the opening government brought to this debate, we thought that there was a general theme within their case and a very principled stance that was clear that said that killing is bad, that killing undermines humanity and security, and that governments shouldn't sully their hands by having any role in killing, and there shouldn't be state-sanctioned killing, and it's bad messaging. We think that what the government did in this debate was effectively assume a very low burden in proving that in the worst case scenarios, like as in when someone in China is executed for downloading pornography on their computer, that was bad. We thought they perhaps should have aimed a little bit higher and accepted some of the cases that the opening opposition were talking about, like terrorism and genocide, and why individuals who conducted those crimes did not deserve the death penalty, and why nobody deserved the death penalty. So we think they kind of lowered the burden on themselves. We think as well that there were structural problems in the way both speeches were made that meant material went underdeveloped. So issues that were picked up by the closing half, which ultimately put the closing government in first position, stuff including what happens to people who are wrongfully convicted, things about deterrent, were briefly mentioned in the opening half, but they were in no way developed to such an extent that we could say the opening team of the debate owned that material. So it left a lot of room for the closing team to come in and talk about that material. So basically we think that the opening government brought in an insufficient substantial case to this debate. Their material was underdeveloped, and we think that they set themselves a low burden by picking the worst case scenarios, like when the death penalty was most egregious, rather than opposing the death penalty when it was perhaps most justified. The rankings between the other three teams were much more confused, and we centered most of our panel discussion on that. Ultimately, we decided that one common problem plagued the opposition benches, and that common problem was ultimately the fault of the opening opposition, who introduced the tension within their case. So something that was very apparent in the opposition leader's speech was that there were two lines of argument within the opposition case to oppose a ban on the death penalty. The first was that there were circumstances in which the death penalty was justified, where crimes were so egregious they denied the lives of civilians on a mass and systemic basis. And those included things like terrorism and genocide and serial killing. The second line of argument with the opening opposition also progressed, which was part of their case, and then became apparent through a point of information, was that countries should have their own right to determine, in their own cultural context, what is an appropriate form of punishment. So then they were forced to assume this burden to defend the idea that countries should be able to execute civilians wherever they were, for whatever reason within their country, because they had the right to use the death penalty. But really, most of their argumentation was about why in certain cases where there were most egregious breaches, the death penalty was justified. And so that tripped them up, and they ended up arguing both those lines of argument, which was a logical inconsistency and hampered their ability to develop the crime. The reason why they were placed third over the fourth position in this debate is that we thought that they were able to bring out some great challenges to the first opening government material, which really exposed the weaknesses of that case. So they were able to show that punishment is always a wrong, in the sense that like preventing someone from acting out their liberty or having freedom of movement was a wrong, but that was justified in the case that this person had foregone their rights when committing that. They also talked about the systemic nature of crime, and they planned the types of crimes that they wanted to defend and why people were not subject to whims and passion, and therefore there would be a deterrent effect. So they were able to challenge those assumptions of first government. Ultimately though, that tension in their case put them in third position. This was a tension that also tripped up second opposition in this debate, who received the second place. So while we thought their extension was quite clear, and a good example of what a deeper analysis extension looks like on the point of closure, where they built on the material the first opposition introduced about the feelings of victims, to talk about the processes of justice and why closure was necessary for society as a whole, and why society deserved to be vindicated through the punishments that were meted out to criminals. We thought that this continuing line about cultural relativism was problematic for the opening and closing opposition and consumed too much of their case. The second reason why we placed them second and not first in this debate was an issue of responsiveness. We thought the closing government in today's debate benefited from the fact that their extension was not rebutted much in the member speech of government. It was only dealt with in the opposition whip speech, particularly at later sections of their speech. And by contrast to that, we thought a strength of the government team, closing government team that won this debate, was their level of responsiveness. So to deal with the first half, they talked about this issue of reversibility and the inability to compensate for the type of harm incurred by people who were wrongfully convicted, then executed. And that fed into their extension, which showed the relevance of their extension, when they were able to say that innocent people would lose their lives, again in a lot more detail than was covered in the first half. So that responsiveness showed the centrality of their extension and why that issue of innocent civilians being killed was so important. We also thought that we did quite a comprehensive job of dealing with the extension of the closing government by talking again about why feelings shouldn't determine punishment, and talking about this tax issue that was well resuscitated by the summary speaker, but perhaps not in the same way that the member speaker had made that point. We don't think that this is a very clear win to the closing government. We thought their point about martyrs, in terms of like the leaders of organised crimes being glorified, was a confused point that wasn't one that was explained that well or developed well by the whip speaker, which meant that while their extension was new, it wasn't always that relevant to the debate. So that meant that it was very close. But we thought they were the most responsive team. They had the most consistent line of arguments that they placed first. The closing opposition had some new material, but were ultimately bogged down by this logical inconsistency and were a little bit unresponsive to closing government, so they placed second. First opposition, or opening opposition in this debate, presented some excellent challenges to opening government, but ultimately this tension between cultural relativism and exceptional crimes where they were willing to justify the death penalty meant their line of argumentation was confused. First proposition in this debate failed to develop clear substantive material and then defended in a way that meant they could remain in the debate, so they received the fourth place. So that is a really lengthy example of how an adjudication would take place, and perhaps isn't the best model adjudication for this reason. Because we thought three teams were so closely bunched together in this debate, had to spend a lot of time discussing what the differences between those three teams were. Not all debates will be this muddy and confusing. And in the event that you can bring more clarity than I just did, you should. But the easiest way to structure an oral adjudication is to ensure that you announce the rankings at the beginning and then go through the rankings, normally from first to fourth, explaining the difference between teams. So you can do it in the reverse order if you like, but it's generally easier to begin by saying, X team won the debate because they did this and this. This is why they beat the team that came second. The team that came second were beaten on that issue. Another thing that held them back was this, but what they did was this and this well. That put them ahead of the third team in this debate. The third team in this debate were held back by their inability to get on top of this argument or to deal with X and Y, but overall their position was clear, and that meant that they beat the fourth team. So just work through the rankings of the most